Great to talk to you here. There's been, I think, a persistent pattern where a lot of folks on Wall Street have suggested that this trade dispute was almost inevitably heading for some kind of negotiated agreement, that it seemed like it was in both parties' interest. I guess we're seeing evidence to the contrary here. How do you see it playing out from here?
Yeah, I don't think it was inevitable that we were going to have an explosive tit-for-tat trade confrontation. But once President Trump and the Trump administration decided they were going to go after Huawei for national security purposes, that frankly is a much bigger deal for the Chinese government than the tariffs that the Americans have put on them so far. The Chinese now just coming out of their big annual summer leadership retreat, hitting back hard after President Trump had said that he can't see working with Huawei for national security purposes. So, I mean, it seems to me we kind of have hit the tipping point, and the fact is that you're not going to get any form of constructive engagement between the U.S. and China soon. The question is whether the wheels are falling off or whether we're just going to continue to be at a new status quo.
The president tweeted, "We don't need China and, frankly, would be far better off without them." Is he right?
Well, I mean, he's certainly right that the United States would be better off if we didn't have a confrontation with the world's second largest economy that doesn't agree with a free market system. So in that regard, it'd be better if we didn't have that competitor, if we didn't have a major state capitalist economy, if everyone supported the free market and rule of law. But given that China is there and they are the size they are and they do have the system they do, the two largest economies in the world need to trade. And while we certainly would much rather if they adhere to our rules and stop stealing our intellectual property, the fact that Trump tweets that American companies need to start making plans to get out of China is not in any way feasible for the foreseeable future.
Ian, President heading to the G7 gathering this weekend. I guess there's no real sense that this is going to be front and center on the agenda, these particular suggestions that he made today. But how do the allies view this, and what's their role, if anything, as they try to essentially look for ways to revive their own economies?
They're worried about this. Friends of mine that are attending the G7 have gone from nothing's going to happen at the G7 to suddenly it's become interesting, it's become concerning. Certainly the fact that President Xi made this announcement literally as Trump is traveling to the G7. I mean, it's kind of maximal embarrassment, undermining the position of the U.S. president, saying, no, we're not moving towards more negotiations in a month. Actually, we're going to hit you preemptively, in a sense, before this meeting. Puts Trump in a very bad mood. President Macron had already given up on the idea of doing a communique at the G7, the first time that they've decided to not bother with one since the G7 started in 1975. That's a big deal. And the potential that Trump is going to be a lot more combative coming off a 700-point market down day for that weekend with a whole bunch of leaders that he has a hard time, in many cases, getting on with at all. And he certainly doesn't like to be in a room multilaterally with them because he thinks they gang up on him. All of that bodes for a very rocky weekend.
So what next, Ian? When your Wall Street clients call you and ask, what can the Chinese do for further retaliation, and what are the Americans going to do for further retaliation? What are the risks that you lay out?
Well, there's a big question about whether Huawei is going to last as a company. Can they sustain themselves if all they have is access to consumer telecom markets, but not to critical infrastructure? And if it looks like they're going to fall apart, then I think the Chinese have to move beyond tariffs and start looking at direct hits to access of American corporations on the ground. So, for example, is Apple going to be doing business in China in the same way they are right now over the course of the next 3-6 months? I think everyone has to be watching that very carefully. What about Americans that are on the ground in China? You saw once we hit Huawei, it was the Canadians that actually decided to grab that CFO, the daughter of the founder, when the Americans asked them to. And Canadians were detained as a consequence in China. Are Americans going to start getting detained? And how does Trump respond to that? How's American media going to operate in China going forward? I mean, there are an awful lot of linkages when we're talking about the world's two largest economies. And the Chinese, though they have much less to do on tariffs against the Americans, they, of course, don't import nearly as much from the United States as they export to us. They have plenty of non-tariff means to hit back if they want to. And I suspect that in the near-term future, they're going to.
Jonathan Swan of Axios, a reporter there, is tweeting right now, Mike. Sources briefed on the president's thinking say to expect a new tariff announcement imminently and to keep an eye on his Twitter. We did expect the president to announce something. It's partly why we saw such a steep decline in the markets, right? He said he was going to respond to the Chinese. I mean, Ian, is this going to be the way it goes back and forth?
You know, I think that Trump has been very concerned that going after the consumer goods in the United States, that the reason he made that delay until Christmas time was because he doesn't want the average American to feel it directly in the pocketbook. But if he feels that that's now inevitable, and he knows that he is considered to be the standard bearer for a harder line policy on China, and there's a lot of bilateral support for that from the national security community, the foreign policy establishment, from Democrats and Republicans across the aisle in Congress, then you can imagine with someone with well over a year before the actual election that he says, you know what, I'm going to take the hit right now in the economy. I'll blame Jay Powell. I'll blame Xi Jinping, but I'm actually all in on tariffs. So, yeah, I really do think the next few months have the potential to be pretty severe in terms of geopolitics of the world's most important relationship impacting the markets. And you're going to hear a lot more of the R word as a consequence of that, geopolitics driving the potential for recession.